The snow was falling harder than it had in decades, and Christmas Eve was supposed to be about family, warmth, and forgiveness. Instead, I found myself standing on the marble steps of what used to be my home, clutching a single suitcase while my breath formed clouds in the frigid air. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at 29 years old, I never imagined I'd be spending the most sacred night of the year as an exile from my own bloodline. The events that led to this moment started 3 months earlier when I lost my job at the marketing firm downtown. Budget cuts, they called it. Downsizing for efficiency. Whatever corporate jargon they wanted to use, the reality was simple. I was unemployed right before the holidays with bills stacking up like autumn leaves. Pride kept me from asking for help immediately, but desperation has a way of breaking down even the strongest walls. When I finally swallowed my ego and called my parents, the conversation felt strained from the first hello. Mom's voice carried that familiar edge of disappointment, the same tone she'd used when I chose art school over business, when I dated musicians instead of lawyers, when I moved across the country to chase dreams that never quite materialized. Dad barely spoke, offering only grunts of acknowledgement when Mom repeated everything I'd said for his benefit. They agreed to let me stay through the holidays while I figured things out. A temporary arrangement, they emphasized, just until I got back on my feet. I should have known then that their definition of temporary would be vastly different from mine. I should have recognized the warning signs in their clipped responses and careful word choices. The house looked exactly the same as it had during my childhood, yet everything felt different. The Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, decorated with the same ornaments we'd hung year after year, but now it felt like a museum display rather than a symbol of family tradition. My younger sister Emma had transformed from the bratty kid who used to steal my Halloween candy into a polished 26-year-old with a corner office and a trust fund that made my student loan debt look like pocket change. She greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a hug that lasted exactly 3 seconds before she pulled away. The designer dress she wore probably cost more than my rent, and the diamond earrings catching the light made it clear that life had treated her very differently than it had treated me. Emma had always been the golden child, the one who followed the path our parents had carefully laid out, while I stumbled through detours and dead ends. Dinner that first night was an exercise in polite conversation and carefully avoided topics. We talked about the weather, about Emma's latest promotion, about Dad's golf game, about anything except the obvious elephant in the room, my spectacular career failure and uncertain future. Mom served my favorite meal from childhood, pot roast with all the fixings, but every bite tasted like obligation rather than love. The next few weeks passed in a blur of job applications and awkward family dinners. I spent my days hunched over my laptop in the guest room, sending out resumes and cover letters that disappeared into the digital void without so much as an automated response. The rejections came swift and brutal, each one chipping away at what little confidence I had left. Meanwhile, Emma's success seemed to grow brighter by comparison, her achievements highlighted in every conversation like spotlights illuminating my failures. I tried to contribute where I could, helping with household chores and cooking meals when Mom worked late. But every gesture felt scrutinized, every offer of help met with polite refusal and thinly veiled suggestions that I should be focusing on my job search instead. The message was clear. I was a burden, a temporary inconvenience to be tolerated rather than a daughter who needed support. The tension in the house grew thicker with each passing day. Conversations became shorter, glances more pointed, sighs more frequent. I could feel their patience wearing thin, could sense the unspoken deadline approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. Emma stopped pretending to be supportive, making increasingly sharp comments about personal responsibility and the importance of standing on your own 2 feet. Dad retreated further into his newspaper and television, avoiding eye contact whenever possible. Then came the phone call that changed everything. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard Mom's voice from the study, hushed but urgent. She was talking to someone about disappointment and tough love and the need to make difficult decisions. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, and when she emerged, her face wore an expression I'd never seen before. Cold determination mixed with something that might have been relief. That evening, they asked me to join them in the living room for what they called a family meeting. The formality of it should have been my first warning, but I was too tired and too desperate to read the signs properly. I settled into the familiar armchair where I'd opened Christmas presents as a child, expecting maybe a lecture about budgeting or a pep talk about persistence in the job market. Instead, Dad cleared his throat and announced that they'd made a decision about my living situation. The words hit me like physical blows. My time was up, my presence was no longer welcome, and I had until Christmas Eve to find alternative arrangements. No discussion, no negotiation, no appeal process. The verdict had been delivered, and the execution date was set. Mom explained their reasoning with the detached tone of a business presentation. They believed I'd become too comfortable, too dependent on their support. Real growth required real consequences, and continuing to enable my situation would only prevent me from developing the resilience I needed to succeed. Emma nodded along, adding her own observations about how this was really for my own good, how sometimes the people who love you most have to make the hardest choices. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. These were the people who had raised me, who had celebrated my victories and comforted me through defeats, who had promised that family meant never having to face the world alone. Yet here they were, calmly explaining why abandoning me during the most vulnerable period of my life was actually an act of love. The next 3 days passed in a haze of desperate phone calls and frantic planning. Friends offered couches and spare bedrooms, but everything was temporary. Everything came with conditions and expiration dates. The job market remained as hostile as ever, with companies either closed for the holidays or operating with skeleton crews. Every door I knocked on seemed to slam shut before I could even explain my situation. Christmas Eve arrived gray and bitter, with snow beginning to fall as afternoon faded into evening. I'd packed my belongings into 2 suitcases and a duffel bag, the sum total of my adult life reduced to what could fit in a taxi trunk. The house buzzed with preparation for the evening's festivities, family friends arriving for the annual Christmas Eve party that had been a tradition since before I was born. I waited in my room until the last possible moment, listening to the sounds of celebration drifting up from downstairs. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses, and the warm hum of conversation painted a picture of the life I was being excluded from. When I finally descended the stairs with my luggage, the party continued around me as if I were invisible, guests too polite or too uncomfortable to acknowledge the obvious drama unfolding. Emma intercepted me at the front door, her face flushed with wine and excitement. She looked me up and down, taking in the suitcases and the winter coat, and for a moment I thought she might offer some last-minute reprieve, or at least a genuine goodbye. Instead, she smiled that same empty smile from my first day back, and made a comment about how this was probably the best thing that could happen to me, how I'd thank them someday for having the courage to push me out of the nest. Dad appeared beside her, his face a mask of forced resolve. He handed me an envelope containing $200 in cash and the business card of a women's shelter downtown. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement that this might be anything other than a necessary life lesson. Mom remained in the living room with their guests, unable or unwilling to witness the final moment of my expulsion. The front door opened, and the cold air rushed in like a preview of the hours ahead. I stepped out onto the marble steps, my breath immediately visible in the frigid night air. Behind me, Emma's voice carried one final observation, delivered with the casual cruelty that only family members can achieve. She wondered aloud how long it would take me to realize that this was exactly what I deserved. The door closed with a sound like finality itself, the lock engaging with a click that seemed to echo through the empty street. I stood there for a moment, surrounded by my pathetic collection of belongings, watching the warm glow of the party continue through the windows. The snow was falling harder now, coating the perfectly manicured lawn and the luxury cars parked in the circular driveway. That's when I began walking, dragging my suitcase behind me through the accumulating snow, with nowhere to go and no one to call. The neighborhood streets stretched endlessly ahead, each house a fortress of warmth and light that emphasized my isolation. My suitcase wheels carved twin tracks through the fresh snow, the only sound breaking the crystalline silence of Christmas Eve. The cold bit through my coat within minutes, my fingers already numb despite the gloves I'd grabbed at the last second. I had no plan, no destination, just the desperate need to keep moving before the reality of my situation could fully sink in. The shelter's business card felt like lead in my pocket, but something inside me rebelled against using it immediately. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was shock, but I couldn't bring myself to admit that I'd fallen so far so fast. The houses I passed told stories of the life I'd just been banished from. Through unguarded windows, I glimpsed families gathered around dinner tables, children in pajamas waiting for Santa, grandparents dozing in armchairs beside twinkling trees. Each scene was a knife twist, a reminder of what I'd lost and what I might never have again. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for one desperate moment I hoped it might be Mom or Dad, maybe even Emma, calling me back home. Instead, it was a marketing message about holiday sales, the digital equivalent of salt in an open wound. I turned the phone off and shoved it deep into my pocket, unwilling to face any more reminders of my disconnection from the world. The snow was accumulating faster now, my footsteps already disappearing behind me as if the universe was erasing any evidence of my passage. My feet were soaking through my boots, the cold seeping into my bones with each step. The $200 Dad had given me wouldn't last long, especially in a city where even the cheapest hotel rooms cost more than that per night during the holidays. I found myself walking toward the old part of downtown, where the buildings were older and the rent was cheaper. Street lamps cast yellow pools of light through the falling snow, creating an almost magical atmosphere that mocked my circumstances. This should have been a night for wonder and possibility, for family traditions and shared memories. Instead, I was trudging through empty streets like some modern-day exile, cast out from everything I'd once taken for granted. The weight of my situation began pressing down harder with each block. No job, no home, no family willing to help, and now no shelter from a storm that showed no signs of stopping. The friends I'd called earlier had offered sympathy but little else, their own lives too full and complicated to accommodate a house guest indefinitely. The brutal truth was becoming impossible to ignore. I was truly alone. My legs were starting to ache from dragging the suitcase through increasingly deep snow when I spotted a small park nestled between two rows of brownstone apartments. A single bench sat under a street lamp, the metal already covered with a thin layer of white. It wasn't much, but it was somewhere to sit and think, somewhere to catch my breath and figure out my next move. I brushed the snow off the bench and sat down heavily, my suitcase beside me like a loyal dog. The cold from the metal seeped through my coat immediately, but I was too exhausted to care. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen, scrolling through my contacts and trying to find someone, anyone, who might be able to help. But every name brought back memories of conversations that had grown awkward over the past few months, friends who'd gradually stopped calling as my situation became more desperate. The park was completely empty except for me, the snow falling so heavily now that I could barely see the street beyond the circle of lamplight. My breath formed clouds that dissipated quickly in the frigid air, each exhale a reminder that I was still alive, even if I felt like a ghost of my former self. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional distant sound of a car struggling through the snow. I don't know how long I sat there, watching the snow accumulate on my boots and feeling the cold work its way deeper into my body. Time seemed suspended, as if the world had stopped turning just long enough for me to fully comprehend the magnitude of my fall from grace. This morning I'd been a daughter with a room in her childhood home, however uncomfortable the arrangement had become. Now I was a homeless woman on a park bench in a snowstorm, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a rapidly dwindling hope for rescue. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were soft, almost muffled by the snow, but distinct enough to pull me from my spiral of self-pity. I looked up to see a figure approaching through the falling snow, moving slowly but purposefully toward my bench. As the shape grew clearer in the lamplight, I realized it was an elderly woman, her silver hair loose and wild, her thin frame bent against the cold. What shocked me most was her feet. She was walking barefoot through the snow, her pale skin already taking on an alarming purple tinge from the cold. She wore only a thin dress that provided no protection against the elements. Her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to conserve warmth. She looked like she might collapse at any moment, like the winter itself was slowly claiming her. She stopped a few feet from my bench, swaying slightly, and spoke in a voice roughened by cold and exhaustion. She asked if I knew whether any of the local shelters still had beds available, explaining that she'd been walking for hours and found everything full. Her words came out in visible puffs of vapor, each breath a small act of defiance against the brutal night. I wiped my face quickly, suddenly ashamed of my tears when faced with someone whose situation was clearly far worse than my own. I told her I didn't know, that I was in the same boat, homeless and searching for somewhere safe to spend the night. The admission hung between us in the frigid air, two strangers united by circumstances neither of us had chosen. She studied me for a long moment, her eyes sharp, despite the exhaustion etched across her weathered features. Then, without asking permission, she sat down beside me on the bench, leaving careful space between us, as if she understood the unspoken rules of desperate people respecting each other's boundaries. We sat in silence while her breathing gradually steadied, the only sound the whisper of snow hitting the ground. I couldn't stop staring at her feet, now completely white against the dark pavement. The sight of another human being suffering so visibly while I sat there wrapped in my warm coat felt like a physical blow. Something deep inside me cracked open. A wall I'd built around my own pain suddenly crumbling in the face of someone else's greater need. Without thinking, without calculating the cost or considering the consequences, I stood up and began unbuttoning my coat. The wind immediately cut through my sweater, but I barely felt it as I slipped the heavy wool garment off my shoulders. I stepped toward the woman and gently draped it around her trembling frame, pulling the fabric tight to trap what little body heat she had left. She looked startled, then closed her eyes as the warmth enveloped her. Her thin hands, blue with cold, reached up and pulled the coat closer around her neck. When she opened her eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears, her gaze holding mine with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to my soul. She reached out and took both of my hands in hers, her fingers so cold they felt like ice, but her grip surprisingly strong. For a long moment we just sat there connected by touch and shared understanding. Two people who had lost everything, finding something precious in each other's company. The snow continued to fall around us, but for that brief instant, the cold seemed less brutal, the night less endless. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, words that would echo in my mind for years to come. She told me that kindness like mine was rarer than diamonds, more valuable than anything money could buy. Her eyes never left mine as she spoke, as if she were trying to memorize my face or imprint something important directly into my memory. She squeezed my hands once more, then slowly stood up, my coat wrapped around her like armor against the storm. She gave me the smallest smile, an expression of such profound gratitude that it made my chest tight with emotion. Then she began walking away, her figure growing dimmer with each step until the falling snow swallowed her completely, leaving me alone on the bench once again. I sat there shivering in my thin sweater, watching the spot where she'd disappeared, feeling strangely lighter despite having just given away my only protection against the cold. The ache in my chest had shifted somehow, transformed from the sharp pain of betrayal into something softer but no less profound. For the first time since leaving my parents' house, I felt like I'd done something that mattered, something that connected me to my better self. The cold was becoming dangerous now, seeping through my inadequate clothing and threatening to overwhelm my body's ability to generate heat. I knew I needed to find shelter soon, before hypothermia became a real threat. But something had changed in those moments with the stranger. Something fundamental about how I saw myself and my place in the world. I was gathering the strength to stand up and resume my search for warmth when I heard them. The low rumble of multiple engines moving slowly through the snow-covered streets. At first, I thought it might be snowplows or emergency vehicles responding to the storm. But as the sounds grew closer, I realized they were too quiet, too coordinated to be random city services. The first vehicle appeared through the snow like a ghost, sleek and black and moving with purpose. Then another and another, until an entire convoy of identical cars was gliding down the street toward my little park. They moved in perfect formation, their headlights cutting through the storm like searchlights seeking something specific. The lead car pulled to a stop directly in front of my bench, followed by the others in a precise line that blocked the entire street. For a moment, nothing happened. The engines idled quietly, their exhaust visible in the cold air, while I sat frozen with a mixture of fear and fascination. Who traveled like this? What kind of person commanded such an escort? Then the rear door of the middle car opened, and she stepped out. It was her, the barefoot woman I'd just given my coat to, but transformed beyond recognition. Her silver hair was now styled in an elegant arrangement, her thin frame wrapped in what looked like the most expensive coat I'd ever seen. Diamond earrings caught the light from the street lamp, and her feet were encased in boots that probably cost more than my monthly salary had been. She walked toward me with the same purposeful stride I'd witnessed earlier, but now it carried an air of authority that made the falling snow seem to part before her. Her eyes, the same sharp blue that had studied me so intently, now held a different kind of intensity, the look of someone accustomed to having the world bend to their will. She stopped directly in front of my bench, snow swirling around her like a living thing, and smiled the same small smile she'd given me before walking away. But now there was something else in that expression, something that suggested this encounter was far from the random meeting I'd assumed it to be. She spoke my name then, my full name, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, in a voice that carried both warmth and an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite identify. The sound of it in her mouth felt impossible, like hearing a stranger recite your deepest secrets. How could she know who I was? We'd never met before tonight, I was certain of that. Yet she said it with the familiarity of someone who'd known me for years. "You're wondering how I know," she said, reading the confusion written across my face. "I've been watching you, Sarah, not just tonight, but for weeks, months actually, watching how you handle disappointment, how you treat people when you think no one's looking, how you respond when the world strips everything away." The convoy of cars hummed quietly behind her, their engines creating a low soundtrack to her words. I struggled to process what she was telling me. Watching me? For months? The implications sent a chill through my already frozen body that had nothing to do with the temperature. "My name is Victoria Blackwood," she continued, stepping closer to the bench. "Perhaps you've heard of Blackwood Industries. We own approximately 40% of the commercial real estate in this city, along with interests in technology, pharmaceuticals, and renewable energy. The foundation I run distributes roughly $80 million annually to causes I deem worthy." The numbers meant nothing to me in my current state, but the way she said them, the casual authority in her voice, made it clear I was dealing with someone who operated on a completely different level of society. Someone who could afford to travel with a motorcade on Christmas Eve. Someone whose decisions affected thousands of lives. "Every year on this night, I do something that most people in my position would consider insane," she said, settling onto the bench beside me as if we were old friends catching up. "I leave behind all the trappings of wealth and walk these streets as someone who has nothing. No security detail, no designer clothes, no wallet full of credit cards, just me and the night and whoever I might encounter." I stared at her, trying to reconcile this elegant woman with the desperate figure I'd helped just minutes earlier. The transformation was so complete, it felt like witnessing magic, as if she'd stepped out of one reality and into another entirely. Most years, I walk until dawn and return home disappointed in humanity, she continued, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. I encounter people who look through me like I'm invisible, who step over me like I'm debris, who assume that someone in my condition deserves whatever circumstances brought them there. But tonight was different. Tonight, I found you. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small device, tapping the screen with practiced efficiency. After you gave me your coat and I disappeared into the storm, my security team picked me up 2 blocks away. But I didn't go home immediately. Instead, I had them follow you at a distance, watching to see what you would do next. The violation of privacy should have angered me, but I was too stunned to feel anything beyond bewilderment. She'd orchestrated this entire encounter, turned my lowest moment into some kind of test without my knowledge or consent. They watched you sit on this bench for 47 minutes, she said, scrolling through what appeared to be a detailed report. During that time, 3 different people passed by, a man walking his dog who crossed to the other side of the street when he saw you, a couple arguing about directions who didn't even notice you were there, and a teenager who stopped to ask if you were okay. She looked up from the screen, her eyes finding mine in the lamplight. Do you remember what you told him when that 16-year-old boy asked if you needed help? I did remember. The kid had been walking home from his job at the movie theater, still wearing his uniform under an oversized parka. He'd approached cautiously, clearly uncomfortable but genuinely concerned. I'd told him I was fine, just taking a break from walking, and suggested he get home before the storm got worse. You lied to protect him, Victoria said softly. You were sitting here freezing, homeless, with nowhere to go, and when someone offered help, you refused because you didn't want a child to worry about you. That told me everything I needed to know about your character. She stood up then, brushing snow off her expensive coat, with movements that spoke of a lifetime of practiced elegance. I've been searching for someone like you for a very long time, Sarah. Someone who maintains their humanity when the world tries to strip it away. Someone who chooses kindness even when kindness has been denied to them. The rear door of the middle car opened again, and a woman emerged who looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom. Tall, impeccably dressed, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that missed nothing. She approached with a leather portfolio in her hands, and the bearing of someone accustomed to handling important matters. This is Margaret Chen, my chief of staff, Victoria said by way of introduction. She's going to explain an opportunity that I believe will interest you greatly. Margaret opened the portfolio and extracted a thick document bound in expensive paper. Ms. Mitchell, what I'm about to propose may sound incredible given your current circumstances, but I assure you that Mrs. Blackwood is completely serious. She's offering you a position with the Blackwood Foundation starting immediately. I looked between the 2 women, trying to process words that seemed to belong to someone else's life. A position? With a foundation that distributed millions of dollars? It felt like a hallucination brought on by hypothermia and desperation. The role would be multifaceted, Margaret continued, her voice crisp and professional despite the surreal setting. You'd begin as an apprentice of sorts, learning how we evaluate grant applications, conduct site visits, and measure the effectiveness of our investments in human potential. The starting salary would be $75,000 annually, with full benefits and housing provided in one of our properties downtown. The numbers hit me like physical blows. $75,000 was more than I'd ever made in my life, more than I'd dared to dream about during my months of unemployment. Housing provided meant I wouldn't be sleeping on park benches or begging friends for couch space. There would be conditions, of course, Victoria said, reclaiming control of the conversation. This isn't charity, Sarah. This is an investment in someone I believe has the potential to eventually take over the foundation when I'm no longer able to run it. The work would be demanding, the hours long, and the responsibility enormous." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the space between us. "You'd be responsible for decisions that affect thousands of lives, for determining who gets help and who doesn't, for ensuring that every dollar we spend creates real change rather than temporary relief. It's not a job for someone looking for easy answers or quick fixes." Margaret handed me the document, its weight substantial in my frozen hands. "The contract outlines everything in detail, but the basic terms are straightforward. A 5-year commitment, with performance reviews every 12 months. If at any point Mrs. Blackwood determines that you're not suited for the role, or if you decide it's not what you want, either party can terminate the agreement with 60 days' notice." I stared down at the papers, the words blurring in the lamplight as snow continued to accumulate on the pages. This morning, I'd been a failure living in my childhood bedroom. Tonight, I'd been cast out into a storm with nothing, and now I was being offered a lifeline that seemed too good to be real. "Why me?" I asked, the question coming out as barely a whisper. "You said you've been watching for months, but I've done nothing remarkable. I lost my job. I couldn't pay my bills. I had to move back in with my parents who threw me out on Christmas Eve. I'm not exactly a success story." Victoria sat back down beside me, her expensive coat rustling softly. "Success isn't measured by how high you climb when everything goes your way, Sarah. It's measured by how you behave when everything falls apart. I've seen people with every advantage in the world crumble at the first sign of adversity. I've seen others with nothing maintain their dignity and compassion even when the world treats them cruelly." She gestured toward the street where her convoy waited patiently. "I could hire any number of MBAs with perfect credentials and impressive resumes. People who've never missed a meal or slept on a park bench or wondered where their next paycheck would come from. But I don't want someone who's never been broken, because broken people are the only ones who truly understand how to fix things." Margaret checked her watch with the efficiency of someone whose time was precisely scheduled. "Mrs. Blackwood, the storm is intensifying. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere warmer?" Victoria nodded and stood again, extending her hand toward me. "The car is heated, Sarah. We can drive while you read through the contract, answer any questions you might have. But I need to know soon whether you're interested in this opportunity. There are other candidates I could approach, though none I'm as hopeful about as you." I looked down at the contract in my hands, then up at the 2 women who represented a future I'd never imagined possible. Behind them, the convoy of black cars waited like something out of a movie, their headlights cutting through the falling snow. The bench beneath me was accumulating ice, and my thin sweater provided almost no protection against the bitter cold. The smart choice was obvious. Accept the ride, get out of the storm, listen to what they had to offer. Even if the job turned out to be something I couldn't handle, even if Victoria Blackwood was some kind of elaborate con artist, I'd at least be warm while I figured it out. The alternative was spending Christmas Eve searching for an open shelter or freezing to death in a park. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the surreal nature of the entire encounter. Maybe it was the lingering shock of my family's betrayal. Or maybe it was simply the feeling that accepting this offer would change my life in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. Once I got in that car, once I signed those papers, there would be no going back to the person I'd been this morning. "I need to ask you something," I said, looking directly at Victoria. "This test of yours, this annual walk through the city in disguise, how many people have passed it over the years? How many times have you made this offer?" Her smile was enigmatic, neither confirming nor denying the implications of my question. "Does it matter? Would knowing change your decision?" I considered that for a moment, snow melting on my face as I thought about what really mattered here. The truth was, it didn't matter how many others she'd tested or what had happened to them. What mattered was that I was sitting on a park bench in a blizzard with nowhere else to go, and someone was offering me a chance at something better. "No," I said finally. "I suppose it doesn't matter." I stood up slowly, my legs stiff from the cold and the weight of everything that had happened. The contract felt heavier in my hands now, dense with possibility and responsibility. Margaret opened the rear door of the middle car, and I could see the warm glow of the interior, smell the rich leather of the seats. "There's just one more thing I need to know," I said, pausing before stepping toward the vehicle. "My family, the people who put me out tonight. They'll probably see this as validation of their decision, proof that their tough love approach worked. I need to know that taking this job won't somehow prove them right." Victoria's expression grew serious, her eyes reflecting something that might have been understanding or might have been steel. "Sarah, your family didn't create this opportunity. Your character did. How you choose to handle success will be entirely up to you, but it won't have anything to do with their decision to abandon you when you needed them most." She gestured toward the open car door. "The question you need to ask yourself isn't whether they'll feel vindicated. The question is whether you're ready to build a life that doesn't require their approval or anyone else's. Whether you're ready to discover who you really are when you're not trying to meet someone else's expectations." The snow was falling so heavily now that the streetlights looked like blurred stars, and the cold was becoming genuinely dangerous. I could feel my body starting to shut down, my thoughts becoming sluggish as hypothermia threatened to take hold. Whatever doubts I had about Victoria's offer, whatever questions remained unanswered, they would have to wait until I was somewhere warm and safe. I walked toward the car, each step feeling like a decision to trust in possibilities I couldn't yet fully understand. The interior was exactly as luxurious as I'd expected, all soft leather and polished wood, but what struck me most was the warmth. It enveloped me immediately, causing my frozen skin to tingle as sensation returned to my extremities. Victoria settled beside me while Margaret took the seat across from us, and the car pulled away from the curb with barely a whisper of sound. Through the tinted windows, I watched the park bench where I'd almost frozen to death disappear into the storm, already becoming just another memory in a night full of impossible things. "Where are we going?" I asked as the convoy moved through the empty streets with practiced precision. "Home," Victoria said simply, "to begin the next chapter of your life, assuming you decide you want to write it with us." The convoy glided through the storm-swept streets like a procession of shadows, each vehicle moving with the synchronized precision of a well-rehearsed ballet. I pressed my face against the tinted window, watching the city transform under the relentless snowfall. The familiar landmarks of my childhood looked alien now, wrapped in white and emptied of life by the brutal weather. Victoria sat beside me in contemplative silence, her fingers drumming a subtle rhythm against the leather armrest. The transformation from desperate homeless woman to commanding billionaire still felt surreal, like watching someone shed their skin and emerge as something entirely different. Margaret worked quietly on her tablet across from us, the screen's glow casting shadows across her sharp features as she typed with mechanical efficiency. "The Foundation headquarters is closed for the holidays," Victoria said suddenly, breaking the comfortable quiet. "But there are things you should see tonight, before you make your final decision. Places that will help you understand the scope of what we're asking you to take on." The lead car turned onto a street I didn't recognize, and I realized we were heading toward the old warehouse district downtown. It was an area I'd avoided during my job search, too rough and industrial to house the kind of companies I'd been targeting. But as we drove deeper into the maze of converted buildings and renovated factories, I began to notice signs of life that hadn't been visible from the main roads. Warm light spilled from windows that should have been dark, and despite the late hour and brutal weather, people moved along the sidewalks with purpose. Not the hurried scramble of those seeking shelter, but the steady gait of individuals who belonged here, who had somewhere specific to go. "Second Chance Village," Margaret said without looking up from her screen. "One of our flagship projects, 350 units of permanent supportive housing, along with job training facilities, childcare, medical clinic, and community spaces. We opened it 18 months ago." The convoy slowed as we approached a complex of buildings that seemed to glow from within. Despite the storm, the pathways were clear and well lit, lined with benches and small gardens that somehow looked inviting even under their blanket of snow. Through the large windows, I could see families gathered in common areas, children playing despite the late hour, elderly residents reading in comfortable chairs. Everyone who lives here was homeless at some point, Victoria continued. Not temporarily displaced like you were tonight, but chronically homeless. Some for years, some for decades. The average resident had been on the streets for 47 months before we found them. She paused as our car pulled into a small parking area, the other vehicles arranging themselves with military precision around us. The traditional approach to homelessness treats the symptoms rather than the disease. Temporary shelters, meal programs, emergency services, all necessary, but all designed around the assumption that people will eventually figure out how to rejoin society on their own. Margaret closed her tablet and looked directly at me. Mrs. Blackwood's philosophy is different. She believes that once someone has fallen through the cracks of society, they need more than just a hand up. They need a complete infrastructure of support, a community designed to help them rebuild not just their living situation, but their sense of self-worth and belonging. The car doors opened simultaneously, and I stepped out into the cold night air. But here, sheltered between the buildings and warmed by the evidence of human habitation all around us, the storm felt less hostile. A security guard approached from a small booth near the entrance, his face lighting up with recognition when he saw Victoria. "Mrs. Blackwood, we weren't expecting you tonight," he said warmly. "Terrible weather to be out in." "Sometimes the worst weather reveals the most important truths, Marcus," she replied, shaking his hand with genuine affection. "How are things here? Everyone staying warm?" "Everybody's accounted for," he assured her. "Community rooms packed tonight, families. Watching movies, kids working on a puzzle that's about the size of a ping-pong table. Mrs. Rodriguez is teaching some of the teenagers to play guitar." Victoria smiled, and for the first time since I'd met her, the expression reached all the way to her eyes. "Would you mind if we took a quick walk through? I'd like to show my friend here what we've built." Marcus produced a set of keys and led us through the main entrance into a lobby that felt more like a high-end apartment building than a housing project. The floors were polished hardwood, the walls decorated with artwork created by residents, and comfortable seating areas invited conversation and connection. But what struck me most was the sound. Laughter, conversation, the normal noise of people living their lives. "Each unit is fully furnished," Margaret explained as we walked through corridors lined with individual doors, each marked with apartment numbers and decorated according to the residents' personal tastes. Lease. Agreements are standard one-year terms, renewable indefinitely as long as residents participate in the community programs and maintain their living spaces. We paused outside a door where I could hear a television playing softly and smell something delicious cooking. Through the small window, I glimpsed a woman in her 50s stirring something on the stove while a man about the same age set the table for two. They moved around each other with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd found their place in the world. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the cruelest circumstances. That Christmas Eve taught me that family isn't always blood, and home isn't always the place you grew up. When everything was stripped away, when I had nothing left to give, I discovered the person I truly was. If you've ever felt abandoned by those who should love you most, know this: your story isn't over. The next chapter might be the most beautiful one yet.